living with the returned presence. When Scripture speaks of restoration, it does not end with recognition. It moves into something deeper, the learning of dwelling. After silence, after hidden alignment, after the gentle beginnings of return, the household discovers that nearness itself must be learned again. Presence is no longer distant, yet it is not meant to be handled with urgency or excitement alone. It becomes a rhythm. The first change is subtle. Life slows, not because nothing is happening, but because everything no longer needs to be forced. Prayer feels like breathing rather than reaching. Worship settles into daily faithfulness rather than moments of intensity. The people begin to live as though God's nearness is real, not fragile, not temporary, but steady. This is where many hearts struggle. Longing shaped them during exile. Watching formed them during silence. But now longing must give way to responsibility. The adopted children, who learned to wait without reward, now learn to carry nearness without grasping. They no longer measure their lives by signs or moments. They begin to measure by faithfulness. Scripture shows that when presence becomes steady, God restores order first. Homes are repaired, relationships reconcile. Justice becomes ordinary rather than heroic. Nothing appears dramatic from the outside, yet everything feels different within. The atmosphere shifts, fear loosens its grip. Decisions come from peace rather than pressure. And within this quiet stability, the daughter is no longer perceived only through concealment. Her presence becomes relational, known through gentleness, through the protection of pace, through the way the household learns to move without striving. She does not stand above the people. She walks among them, guiding the rhythm of restoration so that nearness remains safe. Presence becomes home, no longer a distant hope, no longer a fragile beginning, but a dwelling that shapes daily life. The watchers among the adopted children begin to change as well. Watchfulness softens into stewardship. They no longer look only for movement. They guard the atmosphere that allows movement to continue. Their faithfulness becomes quiet influence, not leading by declaration, but stabilizing through humility. And slowly a new culture forms. Peace replaces urgency. Trust replaces fear. Obedience becomes natural rather than strained. Scripture reveals that this is when glory begins to deepen, not as overwhelming light, but as a weight of presence that rests comfortably among the people. They learn that glory is not meant to be chased or displayed. It is meant to be carried. Carrying glory requires something exile could not teach and silence could not complete, a heart that is both humble and secure. The household learns to move together again, not ahead of God, not behind Him, but with Him. This is living with the returned presence. It is quieter than anticipation, stronger than longing, more enduring than a single moment of revelation. It is the life that begins when restoration stops being an event and becomes a way of being. Let us go deeper, beloved, into the quiet places where Scripture shows what truly changes when presence is no longer distant but dwelling. When the presence becomes steady, the greatest transformation is not external, it is how the heart moves. During exile, obedience often came from fear of losing what little remained. During silence, obedience came from longing, a hope that God would return. But when presence dwells again, obedience changes its source. It begins to flow from agreement rather than effort. The people no longer obey to reach God. They obey because they are already near. This is a subtle shift, yet it reshapes everything. Prayer becomes less about asking and more about listening. Worship becomes less about expression and more about alignment. Daily life becomes the architecture of dwelling, every small decision reinforcing the reality that God is among them. Scripture rarely calls attention to these moments. It speaks instead of lamps kept burning, fields cultivated, children taught, neighbors restored. These ordinary acts form the framework where glory can rest without strain. And this is where the adopted children begin to mature in a new way. Waiting taught them endurance. Return teaches them responsibility. They learn to guard what has been restored, not through control, but through attentiveness. They become careful with speech, gentle with authority, patient with growth. They understand that dwelling is sustained by humility, the same humility that allowed return to begin quietly. Within this atmosphere, the daughter's presence continues to guide the rhythm of life. Her influence is not loud, but it shapes the culture of peace that surrounds the household. She teaches by presence rather than proclamation, showing that nearness is sustained through tenderness, not force. And something remarkable begins to happen. The people stop speaking about restoration as something new. They begin to live as though it has always been meant to be this way. Restoration becomes normal, not ordinary in the sense of losing its sacredness, but familiar in the sense that fear no longer defines it. The household learns to carry glory the way one carries breath, without striving, without display. Scripture shows that this is when stability grows strong enough for expansion. Not expansion driven by ambition, but by life itself. Peace begins to influence those beyond the household. Justice spreads quietly. Compassion becomes visible. Yet even as influence grows, the people remain grounded because they remember silence, they remember exile. Memory becomes a safeguard, keeping humility rooted even as nearness deepens. This is how daily obedience becomes the architecture of dwelling. Every faithful act lays another stone. Every gentle word reinforces the atmosphere. Every moment of trust strengthens the foundation. And over time, the household realizes that the greatest sign of restored presence is not intensity. It is peace that remains, even when circumstances change. When presence becomes a dwelling rather than a visitation, identity itself begins to change. The people no longer define themselves by what they survived, nor by what they lost, but by where they now stand. Exile once shaped their language. Silence once shaped their posture. But nearness reshapes their being. They begin to move through life with a quiet authority that does not come from status or position. It comes from belonging. Scripture describes this belonging not as elevation, but as rootedness, like trees planted by water, no longer searching for stability because stability has already been given. This is why the household grows calmer as glory deepens. Noise decreases. Certainty becomes gentle rather than forceful. Speech carries weight because it is no longer driven by fear of being unheard. The adopted children discover that inheritance is not a future promise alone. It is a present way of living. They no longer strive to prove faithfulness. Faithfulness becomes their atmosphere. Decisions arise from peace instead of pressure. Even correction carries tenderness, because nearness teaches them that restoration is meant to heal, not to dominate. And, as identity settles, the rhythm of the household becomes unmistakable. Morning begins with quiet gratitude rather than urgency. Work becomes worship without needing to be named as such. Rest is no longer guilt, but trust. The daughter walks among them not as a distant symbol, but as a living witness of harmony. Her presence shapes how strength and gentleness meet. Through her, the household learns that authority does not raise its voice. It creates space where others can breathe. She does not hurry the people forward. She keeps them anchored so that increased glory does not pull them into pride. This is where the deepest transformation occurs. The people stop asking, well, are we restored? They begin to ask, how do we keep the dwelling pure? Purity here is not separation from the world, but clarity of heart, an awareness that every choice either strengthens or weakens the atmosphere of nearness. The children grow sensitive to this. They notice how impatience dims peace, how humility restores it, how love keeps the dwelling open. And slowly, without announcement, the memory of exile loses its power to define them. It becomes a testimony rather than a wound. Silence becomes a teacher rather than a fear. Return becomes the soil where identity takes root. Scripture shows that this is the quiet authority of those who live with presence. They no longer chase affirmation from outside the household. They carry within them a steadiness that does not need to be proven. Belonging becomes their language. Peace becomes their strength. Dwelling becomes their life. And in this settled identity, glory rests without strain, not as a light that demands attention, but as a warmth that fills everything it touches. There is one more layer, very quiet, almost hidden beneath everything that has been spoken. When presence becomes a dwelling and identity settles into belonging, Scripture reveals something that is rarely said aloud. The greatest change is not that God comes closer, it is that the heart stops standing at a distance. During exile, the people learn to survive. During silence, they learn to wait. During return, they learn to recognize. But in dwelling, they learn to rest without guarding themselves. This is the hidden layer. Many imagine that once restoration arrives, life becomes more intense, more elevated, more extraordinary. Yet Scripture shows something different. The deepest maturity of a household is when holiness feels safe. The people no longer approach God cautiously as though nearness might disappear again. Fear loosens its final hold. They begin to trust that presence is not a passing moment, but a covenant reality. And this transforms how they see themselves. They stop striving to be worthy. They stop measuring their place by past failure. They stop holding their breath. Instead, they live from a quiet assurance that the dwelling is real. This assurance reshapes relationships within the household. Correction becomes gentle because identity is no longer fragile. Service becomes joyful because belonging is no longer uncertain. Even weakness is carried differently, not as a threat to restoration, but as a place where mercy continues to work. The adopted children feel this shift most deeply. Adoption, once experienced as longing to belong, becomes confidence without entitlement. They no longer try to prove they deserve nearness. They receive it with gratitude, and that gratitude softens everything they do. And within this atmosphere, the daughter's presence feels less like guidance from outside and more like harmony within the life of the household. Her rhythm becomes the rhythm of the people, steady, patient, protective of what is sacred. This is why Scripture often describes mature restoration using images of home rather than triumph. A lamp burning through the night. A table set without anxiety. A city at peace within its walls. The hidden layer is not about greater revelation. It is about greater ease in holiness. The people discover that nearness no longer requires striving. They learn to live without the tension that once defined their relationship with God. Reverence remains, but fear fades. Love becomes the atmosphere that sustains everything. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, the household realizes that the deepest miracle of restoration is not that glory returned. It is that hearts learned how to stay open when it did. Beloved, Scripture shows that the journey from exile to dwelling does not end in spectacle, but in peace that remains. What was once longed for has become life itself. Presence no longer felt as distant or fragile, but steady and near. The adopted children, formed through silence and shaped by return, learn to live without striving, carrying nearness with humility and trust. The daughter walks among them in quiet harmony, guiding the rhythm so that glory rests gently rather than overwhelming the household. Identity is no longer rooted in what was lost, but in belonging that cannot be shaken. Prayer becomes breath, obedience becomes agreement, and holiness becomes a place where the heart can rest without fear. The God who withdrew with mercy has returned with tenderness, and the people who once watched in silence now dwell in communion, not seeking signs, not chasing moments, but living each day as a sacred home where peace endures and love keeps the dwelling open. Thank you for being here. If this teaching helped you, please like, comment, and share. It truly helps this message reach those who are seeking. To our new subscribers, welcome. And if you'd like to go deeper, we invite you to join as a member. The link is in the description and on our homepage. We are praying for you and standing with you in the light of Messiah, He, and Messiah, She. If you'd like to support the ministry, you can visit our store or bless our dear brother Michael via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, which also includes a link to our second store with new designs. Thank you for your love and encouragement, and stay tuned for the next video. May the spirit of wisdom and peace rest upon you always.